On June 4th, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, Unoffizier Herman Butcher gripped the ship's railing tightly as he made his way down the gangplank, his legs unsteady after 14 long days crossing the Atlantic. Through the morning haze, he witnessed something that completely contradicted the 3 years of Nazi propaganda he had been fed. The American dock workers, both white and black, worked together seamlessly, operating machinery that seemed to belong to another century. Women in coveralls expertly controlled massive cranes, while children hawked newspapers at the gates. There was no sign of panic, no one running from the sight of enemy soldiers. Instead, Butcher watched as civilians moved about, unbothered by the presence of their captives. "Die spin und die Americana," Butcher whispered to the man behind him. "The Americans are crazy." This moment would later be immortalized in Butcher's memoir, Behind Barbed Wire, published in Germany in 1952, offering one of the most detailed accounts of prisoner life in America. The Norfolk Naval Base stretched across 4,300 acres of land, with docks that extended beyond the horizon. But it wasn't just the immense scale of the port that left the German prisoners stunned, it was the normalcy. Here, civilians walked freely near military installations. Vendors sold coffee and donuts in the shadow of warships, and a brass band played popular music at a nearby war bond rally. To Butcher and his comrades, this was more than mere abundance. It was a nation at war, behaving as if it were not at war at all. The Americans, so secure in their power, treated their mortal enemies as if they were simply wayward houseguests. What they would witness in the coming months wouldn't just be American abundance. They had heard those stories. What would truly unsettle them were the bizarre customs and inexplicable behaviors that defied everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies. These practices would prove to be more destructive to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat. The processing at Norfolk began with what Butcher would later describe in his memoir as the first impossibility. German military doctrine taught from Poland to France to Africa dictated that prisoners were either assets to be exploited or burdens to be minimized. The Geneva Convention was acknowledged only when it was convenient and ignored when it wasn't. But here, American officers, speaking fluent German, read the Geneva Convention rules to the prisoners, explained their rights, and even inquired about their dietary needs. According to International Red Cross records from June 1943, Jewish American personnel, several of whom had distinctly Jewish surnames, distributed Red Cross packages, while explaining that kosher meals were available for any Jewish prisoners. Some German soldiers, nervous and skeptical, laughed, thinking it was some kind of mockery, but it wasn't. The American military had anticipated the religious dietary needs of its enemies. But the most incomprehensible moment came during the first medical inspection. German prisoners with wounds received the same penicillin as American soldiers, a miracle drug that was scarce even in Germany's field hospitals. A Swiss Red Cross inspector, Guy Matreau, would later note in his July 1943 report, medical treatment provided to German prisoners equals or exceeds that given to American military personnel. To the prisoners, this quality of care was beyond belief. It was an impossibility. Butcher, like the others, could not fathom it. The idea that a nation at war would treat its enemies in such a manner, it was a disorienting experience, and one that would begin the unraveling of the Nazi worldview. The disorientation intensified as the German prisoners were led to the processing center at Norfolk. For men who had fought through Europe, Africa, and beyond, the experience felt like an alien world. Butcher, still grappling with the images of American normalcy, found the treatment they received at the hands of their captors even more confounding. German military doctrine, forged in the brutal tactics of war, dictated that prisoners were either assets to be exploited or burdens to be minimized. In Nazi-occupied territories, prisoners of war were often treated with callous disregard, if not outright cruelty. But here, in this strange land, things were different. American officers, speaking fluent German, sat across from the prisoners with open documents, calmly explaining their rights under the Geneva Convention. These officers were not just following orders, they seemed genuinely concerned with the prisoners' welfare. Butcher stared in disbelief as an officer read from a German-language copy of the Geneva Convention, ensuring that every prisoner understood their rights, rights that Butcher had been told were non-existent for the enemy. He watched as the officer asked questions about prisoners' dietary needs, noting down preferences with a seriousness that made no sense to him. Even more unsettling was the appearance of Jewish American personnel, including several sergeants with clearly Jewish surnames. These men distributed Red Cross packages with the same reverence they would have shown to their own comrades. Butcher and the others could scarcely comprehend what was unfolding. They had been taught to dehumanize everyone who wasn't of the master race, but here, the Americans seemed intent on treating them with dignity. Some of the prisoners laughed nervously, convinced this must be some kind of trick or mockery, but it wasn't. The American military had carefully prepared for the religious needs of its enemies. Prisoners were told that kosher meals were available for any Jewish soldiers among them. For many of the Germans, this was the first real shock. And then came the medical inspections, another mind-boggling experience. German soldiers, who had been left to suffer with limited medical supplies in their own country, were now treated with the same level of care as American soldiers. Prisoners with wounds received the miracle drug penicillin, a substance so rare in their homeland that it was practically reserved for the elite. Swiss Red Cross Inspector Guy Matro's July 1943 report confirmed the disbelieving murmurs of the prisoners. Medical treatment provided to German POWs equals or exceeds that given to American military personnel, he wrote. To the men who had fought on the front lines, this was more than a medical miracle. It was proof of something far more difficult to comprehend, that their enemies were not as they had been told. For the first time, Butcher and his fellow prisoners found themselves confronting the staggering differences between what they had been taught to believe and the reality of American society. Here, in the midst of a brutal war, their captors seemed not only civilized, but humane. The image of the enemy that had been burned into their minds for years began to crack piece by piece under the weight of these impossibilities. As the days wore on, the prisoners were forced to face a growing internal conflict. The treatment they were receiving didn't match their expectations, and the world they had once seen as the epitome of evil now seemed to hold a mirror to their own beliefs. The realization was undeniable. The Americans were doing something different, something that would prove far more dangerous to the Nazi ideology than any battlefield victory. The 3-day journey to the interior camps only deepened the cognitive dissonance the German prisoners were already experiencing. Unlike the secretive, guarded transports they had endured in Germany, where prisoners were hidden away in dark, cramped boxcars, the Americans made no attempt to conceal the POWs. Instead, they were transported in regular passenger coaches, the seats cushioned, the windows wide open, and the surroundings far more comfortable than anything they had known in their military service. Butcher watched as they passed through cities and towns, stopping regularly at stations. The idea that their captors would allow civilians to witness their movements was unfathomable. In Germany, prisoners were treated like cargo, kept hidden from public view. But here, in America, the train pulled into Union Station in Washington, D.C., and came to a stop in full view of hundreds of American civilians. The prisoners could do little but stare through the windows, as families waved goodbye to soldiers heading off to training camps. Wives kissed their husbands, children waved small American flags, and teenagers shared milkshakes in the station's restaurant, unaware of the German prisoners just yards away. Butcher was struck by the scene. It wasn't just the overwhelming openness of the moment. It was the casualness with which the Americans moved about their daily lives. The prisoners had expected a fearful nation, one trembling at the thought of the enemy within. Instead, they were witnessing something very different. The civilians seemed unperturbed by their presence, far more concerned with their own lives than with the men in enemy uniforms. As the journey continued, the trains passed through industrial areas, factories with names prominently displayed, signs boasting their size and production capacity. The prisoners, who had been trained to view such sites as high-value targets, couldn't help but notice how exposed these American industries were. There was no camouflage, no effort to hide them from enemy eyes. The massive Glen Ellsworthy Martin aircraft plant in Baltimore came into view, its parking lots full of civilian cars. The German soldiers watched, stunned, as rows of B-26 bombers lined up for delivery, all in plain sight. There was no sense of urgency, no scramble for cover. It was as if they were part of some elaborate military exercise in an open field. The prisoners continued their journey, passing through areas that seemed almost too open to be real: coal mines and steel mills in Pennsylvania, all running at full capacity, their bright orange blast furnaces glowing against the night sky. The workers, too, seemed unaffected by the presence of the prisoners. The idea that these industrial facilities, critical to the war effort, were operating in plain view of their captives seemed almost absurd to Butcher and the others. At each station, the prisoners saw more of the daily rhythms of American life: the simplicity, the ease, the casualness with which people lived. In their own countries, such open displays of power would have been unthinkable. But here, the trains moved on with the same precision as the factories, as if the war was just one part of the complex machinery that made America run smoothly. Butcher was left with one nagging thought: how could the Americans be so confident, so secure in their own power, that they could afford to show their enemies not just their military strength, but their everyday lives? It wasn't just the scale of their industry or the seeming casualness of their society that rattled the prisoners. It was the fact that none of it seemed to be hidden, none of it was guarded with fear. The freedom they saw in every interaction, from families saying their goodbyes to workers going about their business, shook the very foundations of the worldview that had been carefully constructed for them in Nazi Germany. They had been taught to fear the enemy. They had been led to believe that Americans were a divided, weakened people, barely holding their nation together in the face of global conflict. But what they saw instead was a society at war, not in fear, but in full swing, working, living, thriving in the face of everything that had been thrown at it. And that realization was more unsettling than any military defeat. The train finally rolled to a stop at their destination, Camp Hearn, Texas, its towering wooden barracks and vast, seemingly endless fields sprawling before them. As they stepped off the train, the prisoners were immediately struck by the contrast between this place and the brutal, squalid conditions they had expected. Camp Hearn was unlike anything they had ever imagined. For one, the camp was vast. It stretched across 720 acres of land, far more space than they had seen in most of the places they had been imprisoned. But it wasn't just the size that shocked them. The prisoners had been led to believe they would be treated harshly, that they would be confined to overcrowded and filthy cells. But what they encountered was something far beyond that. Wooden barracks stood with the neatness of military discipline, but without the grim austerity they were used to. These buildings were outfitted with electricity, electric lights no less. For a moment, Butcher and the others simply stared at the light bulbs above them, blinking in disbelief. Inside the barracks, they were given individual beds with clean sheets and blankets, a far cry from the thin straw pallets they were used to. There were no shared mats, no overcrowding, just rows of neat, comfortable beds. The floors were even wooden, not the cold stone or dirt floors they had come to expect. Every building had indoor plumbing, complete with flush toilets and hot water heaters, luxuries that seemed beyond their wildest expectations. But the shock didn't end with the basic amenities. The camp's recreation halls had ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and even libraries. The prisoners had not only been given a safe place to sleep and access to sanitation, but they were also being offered ways to pass the time, ways to keep their minds busy as if they were guests rather than captives. Butcher could hardly process it. How was this possible? He had expected a harsh environment to match the brutal military doctrine he had known throughout his life. Instead, he found himself in a place that felt more like a small town than a military internment camp. The entire experience left him shaken. But the greatest surprise was yet to come. The camp's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sasau Stiles, addressed the prisoners in German, something few of the prisoners had expected. Stiles, a university-educated officer, had studied the language before the war, and his German was impeccable. He explained the camp rules with the calm professionalism of a man accustomed to dealing with people from different walks of life. But then he said something that took them all completely off guard. "Here, you will largely govern yourselves," he declared, his words echoing through the camp. "You will elect spokesmen, organize activities, and manage your schedules within the boundaries of military requirements." The prisoners were stunned. Prisoners, governing themselves? The idea seemed absurd. In every camp they had been to, they had been treated like cattle, controlled through fear and punishment. But here, they were being offered autonomy. On some level, it was more than a little unnerving. Was this a trap, or was it a sign of weakness on the part of the Americans? It wasn't just the self-governance that caught them off guard. The camp's medical facilities were equally astonishing. The hospital was fully equipped, with modern medical technologies that were unavailable even in Germany's civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical suites, dental chairs. This was a level of care that most German civilians would never experience. Even the pharmaceutical supplies were beyond what most soldiers had access to, with penicillin available for prisoners as a routine treatment. But it wasn't only the Germans who were affected by the level of care. The camp included African American medical personnel, who worked alongside their white counterparts, providing medical attention to both prisoners and American soldiers. This, too, was a direct contradiction to what the prisoners had been taught. In Germany, such racial contact would have been forbidden by law. But here, the American military seemed to operate on entirely different principles, ones that were difficult for the prisoners to process. The experience at Camp Hearn continued to challenge everything the German soldiers had believed about their enemies, from the physical comforts of the camp to the approach taken by the American military. Nothing aligned with their expectations. The harshness of the war seemed so far away here, replaced instead with something entirely different, something far more humane, even if it made no sense to their ideology. As the days passed, the prisoners would begin to realize that this was no ordinary internment camp. The treatment they were receiving was not just about survival, it was about preserving dignity, about maintaining a semblance of humanity in the midst of war. And that was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. As the days stretched on at Camp Hearn, the German prisoners found themselves confronted not just with physical comforts, but with a profound cultural shock that rattled their very understanding of the world. Each new experience seemed to confirm that America was nothing like the war-torn, weakened nation they had been led to believe it was. One of the first things that struck the prisoners was the role of women in American society. In Nazi Germany, women were mostly relegated to domestic roles, their contributions to the workforce and society generally minimized or ignored. But here, women drove trucks for the Hearn Cotton Oil Mill, ran businesses along Main Street, and supervised male workers in the defense plants. At the nearby Bryan Army Airfield, part of the Women Air Force Service Pilots (WASP) program, women flew military aircraft, serving as pilots in active combat zones. The prisoners, whose own society demanded that women remain submissive and domestic, found themselves dumbfounded by the sight of women in positions of power and authority. The idea that women could command the same respect, could have the same freedoms was a direct contradiction to everything they had been taught about gender roles. But it wasn't just women in power that disturbed them. It was the casualness with which these roles were accepted. It wasn't presented as a strange exception or some revolutionary anomaly. It was simply part of the fabric of American life. Racial dynamics also proved far more complex than anything the prisoners could have imagined. Nazi ideology had ingrained the idea of racial hierarchy, and the German soldiers had been conditioned to view non-Aryans as inferior. Yet at Camp Herne, they found themselves being guarded by black soldiers from the 359th Infantry Regiment, part of the segregated African American units that had been mobilized during the war. The idea that black men could not only serve in the military, but also have authority over white prisoners was anathema to everything the Germans had been taught. Several of the prisoners, particularly those from higher ranks, requested transfers rather than submit to the authority of black soldiers. These requests were swiftly denied. The camp administrators didn't entertain such requests, reinforcing the idea that racial lines, as the prisoners had understood them, didn't apply here. This, too, was a form of disruption, something the Germans could not easily accept. The more the prisoners interacted with their captors, the more they realized that American society, despite its flaws, operated on principles of equality and opportunity that had no counterpart in Nazi Germany. While the prisoners were learning firsthand about racial integration, they also saw the paradox that existed in the very society that had been so kind to them. The racial segregation that was still so present in parts of American life, like the segregated seating in movie theaters and restaurants, stunned the prisoners. They had been taught to view America as a place where racial minorities were subjugated, but what they witnessed here was a society that was evolving, one that was struggling with its own contradictions but had not yet fully resolved them. One prisoner, a lower-ranking officer, found himself working side by side with a black American soldier in the camp's medical facility. The two men, once taught to view each other as enemies, became unlikely comrades as they performed their duties together. For the German soldier, this experience was deeply disorienting. In Germany, it would have been unthinkable for a man of his position to serve alongside someone of a different race, let alone follow their instructions. But here, there was no hesitation, no question of authority. He realized that the concept of racial superiority was a fantasy, an illusion that had been used to justify hatred and oppression. The prisoners were also confronted with the simple fact that American life, despite its complexities, appeared to function with a level of freedom and openness that they had never experienced. They witnessed firsthand the casual defiance of authority that was so common in American society. On a visit to a local farm, the prisoners saw a farmer openly tell a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell over a dispute about crop distribution. The farmer faced no punishment for his outburst, and the prisoners could scarcely believe what they were seeing. In Nazi Germany, such defiance would have led to imprisonment, or worse. And then, in late December 1943, there was the Christmas celebration. Butcher and the other prisoners had heard that the local community was planning a holiday event, but they could scarcely prepare themselves for what would come next. The town of Herne, with a population of just 2,000, mobilized to ensure that the German POWs had a proper Christmas celebration. Local churches collected 4,800 gift packages, schools made handmade cards, and even the American Legion, composed of World War I veterans who had fought Germans, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment. The most emotional moment came during the Christmas Eve services. German prisoners attended Mass in local churches, sitting among the congregation members, many of whom had sons serving overseas. The idea of being inside a church, a place of peace, surrounded by people whose families were at war with Germany, broke several prisoners emotionally. For the first time, they felt the weight of their own actions. The soldiers they had killed, the families they had torn apart. They were not being treated as enemies to be destroyed. They were being treated as human beings. And it was that humanity, the kindness extended to them by the very people they had been taught to hate, that would begin the slow process of breaking down the walls of their indoctrination. These moments were small, seemingly insignificant. But to the prisoners, they were revelations that would continue to unravel the rigid ideology they had once sworn by. By December 1943, the German prisoners had spent enough time at Camp Hearn to begin witnessing the unthinkable. A sense of unease still hung over them, the discomfort of not knowing what to make of the strange, almost unsettling generosity of their captors. They had expected harsh treatment, punishment for their role in the war, but what they received was something entirely different. The holiday season brought with it an experience so far removed from anything the prisoners had anticipated that it almost broke them. For weeks, the prisoners had heard whispers about what was coming, but no one had truly believed it until they saw it with their own eyes. The small town of Hearn, Texas, with a population of just 2,000 people, had mobilized to ensure that the German prisoners would have a proper Christmas celebration. Local churches, schools, and even the American Legion all contributed to what was, for the prisoners, a surreal event. On Christmas Eve, the Hearn Democrat published a full list of the donations made by the community: 4,800 gift packages collected by the churches, handmade cards and decorations made by the school children, and donations of cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment from the veterans of World War I who had once fought against Germans. The Lions Club, a local civic organization, provided musical instruments, and the Garden Club decorated the camp with holly and evergreen boughs. The prisoners stood in disbelief as they looked around the camp. A massive Christmas tree, 30 feet tall, stood at the heart of the compound, adorned with electric lights that burned throughout the night. The lights, shining brightly against the darkness, were a luxury the prisoners had never seen in their own homeland. In fact, the entire display, from the brightly lit tree to the decorations around the camp, used more electricity than most villages in Germany had for all purposes. What made it even more incomprehensible to the prisoners was that this celebration wasn't just for show. The community of Hearn truly seemed to believe that these prisoners, these men who had fought against their sons, husbands, and brothers, deserved this level of care and attention. They were not treated as enemies. They were treated as people, humans, even if they had been enemies in a distant war. The culmination of the Christmas celebration came during the evening's church services. German prisoners attended services at several local churches, including the First Baptist Church, the First Methodist Church, and St. Mary's Catholic Church. The most striking detail was the way the congregants welcomed the prisoners, not with the hostility they had expected, but with an open-hearted kindness that left many of them utterly shaken. One particularly moving moment occurred when the choir of the First Methodist Church performed Christmas carols in German. The choir had learned the songs phonetically, and the sight of American mothers whose sons were fighting overseas, singing to enemy soldiers, shattered the emotional defenses of the prisoners. Several soldiers wept quietly, their once unshakable beliefs beginning to crumble. But it wasn't just the music or the presents that left a lasting impact on the prisoners. It was the meal, the Christmas feast, according to camp records, included roast turkey, ham, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce, mince pie, apple pie, ice cream, and even beer for the enlisted men, with California wine for the officers. The meal, which amounted to over 5,000 calories per person, was a stark contrast to the 1,200 calories the prisoners were accustomed to back home, if they were fortunate enough to get that much. As they ate, the prisoners couldn't help but reflect on the vast gulf between what they had expected and what they were now experiencing. In Germany, even the wealthiest civilians were rarely afforded such a feast. And here, they, captured enemies, were being treated with such incredible generosity. It wasn't just the food or the decorations that stunned them. It was the simple fact that they were being treated as human beings, not just defeated soldiers to be punished, but as people deserving of compassion and care. For Butcher and the others, Christmas, 1943, would become a turning point in their understanding of the American people. It wasn't just the victory on the battlefield that had made them an unstoppable force. It was the strength of their character. The kindness they showed their enemies in a time of war was something the German prisoners had never expected, and it was something that slowly began to erode the deep-seated hatred they had been taught to hold for the United States. As the prisoners gathered around the Christmas tree, exchanging the modest gifts they had received, the realization settled in: this wasn't weakness. It was the strength of a nation secure in its values, a society so confident in its future that it could afford to extend a hand of friendship to the very people who had tried to destroy it. The paradox of it all was staggering, and for many of the prisoners, it began the slow process of reshaping their understanding of the world. This small, quiet act of kindness, this Christmas celebration, would ultimately prove to be more transformative than any battlefield defeat. It was in these moments, these glimpses of humanity, that the prisoners began to question the foundations of their ideology. For the first time, they started to see that the Americans were not just their enemies, they were their teachers, showing them a different way to live, to think, and to be. As the weeks passed at Camp Hearn, the German prisoners began to realize that their captors were doing something far more profound than simply holding them in confinement. They were not just prisoners of war, they were subjects in an experiment of ideological transformation, one that would challenge everything they had believed about themselves, their enemies, and the world. It began with what was described as voluntary education in the camp, though few of the prisoners saw it as voluntary in the beginning. Most of them, especially the hardened Nazis, viewed the idea of attending classes or engaging with American ideas with suspicion, if not outright contempt. But when the program began in earnest, it was impossible to ignore the depth of the material provided to them. The camp library, which started with a modest collection of 500 books donated by the local community, quickly grew into a treasure trove of knowledge. By August 1944, it boasted over 5,000 volumes, many of them by German authors banned by the Nazis. Titles like The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann and All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque became available to prisoners who had spent their lives under the shadow of Nazi censorship. In addition to these works, books by Jewish authors like Lion Feuchtwanger were also part of the collection. The prisoners were given free access to these books, books that, under Nazi rule, would have been considered subversive and dangerous. The fact that they could read these works, works that had once been banned, sent a powerful message: America's values were not just about military might, but about freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of the individual. And the education didn't stop with literature. Professors from Sam Houston State Teachers College, now Sam Houston State University, visited Camp Hearn monthly to conduct courses in English, American history, mathematics, agricultural science, and more. Between 1944 and 1945, 340 prisoners enrolled in correspondence courses, gaining access to an education they had never dreamed of receiving in Nazi Germany. For many prisoners, this was a transformative experience. They began to learn not just about the mechanics of American society, but about the principles that underpinned it: democracy, individual rights, and the rule of law. The idea that these concepts could be applied on a large scale, even in times of war, was something they had never considered. The prisoners began to understand that America's strength was not just in its military might, but in its ideas, ideas that emphasized the importance of the individual over the state, of liberty over authoritarian control. But the most remarkable part of the re-education program was the subtle psychological operations behind it. The camp's Special Projects Division had developed a system to assess the political leanings of the prisoners. They identified 3 categories: anti-Nazis, around 10% of the camp; non-political prisoners, The majority, about 75%, and ardent Nazis. The remaining 15%. Each group received tailored treatment designed to promote ideological change. The anti-Nazi prisoners were given additional privileges. They were selected to become barracks leaders, discussion group moderators, and even editors for the camp's newspaper. This gave them an elevated status, one that allowed them to influence others in the camp, particularly the non-political prisoners. It was through these conversations and interactions that many of the prisoners began to question their Nazi beliefs. The camp's newspaper, Der Spiegel, the Mirror, became a critical part of this transformation. The paper, initially filled with Nazi propaganda, evolved over time into a publication that discussed democratic ideals, American values, and most shockingly to the prisoners, the flaws of the Nazi regime. This was not something the Germans had ever expected to encounter. A public space where criticism of their own government was allowed, even encouraged. By 1944, the content of Der Spiegel reflected a growing shift in the prisoners' attitudes, as they began to embrace democratic discussions and critique the ideology that had once defined their lives. The army psychologists who ran the program also tracked ideological shifts. They observed the prisoners' reactions to news of German defeats and victories, their reading choices, their participation in educational programs, and even their social interactions. The results were clear. After just 6 months of exposure to American society and education, approximately 60% of non-political prisoners showed measurable movement toward democratic ideals. The prisoners were also put to work in American factories, where they were exposed to the abundance and productivity of American industry. The contrast between the relentless scarcity they had known in Germany and the wealth of resources they saw in these factories was jarring. At the Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, for example, the prisoners worked alongside American civilians in a process that seemed almost absurd to them. The workers casually discarded more aluminum scrap in one day than the German aircraft factories could acquire in a week. At food processing plants, the prisoners were struck by the wastefulness they witnessed, perfectly edible produce being discarded for minor cosmetic imperfections. Tomatoes that were slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernels, and beans with minor blemishes, all of it was destroyed, while German civilians had been fighting for scraps. In this environment, the German prisoners began to realize just how distorted their understanding of the world had been. They had been raised on the belief that their nation was the pinnacle of civilization, that the Nazi ideology was the only path to greatness. But what they saw in America shattered that illusion. They began to see democracy not as a weakness, but as a system that could nurture both the individual and the collective. They began to question the principles that had justified the war, and they started to recognize that the strength of a society lay not in its military power, but in its values. By the end of 1944, many of the prisoners had undergone a transformation that was as much psychological as it was ideological. They had witnessed firsthand the kind of society that the Nazis had demonized, a society that valued freedom, diversity, and opportunity. And in doing so, they had begun to change. As the war drew to a close and the prisoners at Camp Hearn awaited their eventual return to a war-ravaged Germany, something unexpected began to happen. The experiences they had undergone, the education, the exposure to American values, and the kindness extended to them by their captors had begun to reshape their understanding of the world. For many of them, the war was over. But their journey of transformation had only just begun. In the years that followed, several of the former German prisoners of war chose not to return to Germany. Instead, they decided to stay in the United States, a country they had once viewed with hostility and suspicion. They had witnessed firsthand the strength and stability of the American system, and many felt a deep sense of gratitude for the treatment they had received during their internment. One such prisoner was Georg Gartner. In September 1945, Gartner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico, and chose to live in America under an assumed name. For the next 40 years, he would live in the United States illegally, marrying an American woman, raising children, and working as a tennis instructor in California. When he finally surrendered in 1985 to participate in a television documentary, he had lived in America longer than he had ever lived in Germany. Gartner's story became a powerful testament to the transformative power of American society, and his decision to remain in the country was a direct result of the experiences he had during his internment. Reinhold Pell, another former prisoner, escaped from Camp Washington, Illinois, in 1945, not because he had been mistreated, but because of his curiosity about American life. For 7 years, Pell lived in Chicago, working in bookstores and even marrying an American woman. Like Gartner, he finally surrendered voluntarily in 1953. His story was similar to Gartner's in that it reflected the powerful impact of the American way of life, which had enticed him to stay rather than return to a devastated Europe. The decision to remain in America was not just about avoiding post-war Europe. For these men, the war had marked a profound turning point in their lives. The ideological transformation they had undergone at Camp Hearn made them see the United States not just as the enemy, but as a place of opportunity, a country that represented the values they had come to admire. The success of these former prisoners who chose to stay in America was evident in their post-war lives. Many of them became successful in their own right. Gartner, for example, went on to write his autobiography, Hitler's Last Soldier in America, which chronicled his incredible journey from a loyal Nazi to an advocate for American democracy. His story not only proved the power of America's values to transform even the most hardened ideologies, but it also validated the role that America played in shaping the world's future after the war. Another prisoner who found success in America was Reinhold Pell, who went on to become a successful businessman after receiving American citizenship in 1959. Pell's story was one of personal reinvention, of moving beyond the constraints of his past and finding a new purpose in a country that had once been his enemy. Like Gartner, he had no desire to return to Germany, which was still struggling to rebuild after the war. The stories of Gartner and Pell were not isolated cases. Many of the German POWs who stayed in America became active contributors to the post-war economy and society. According to post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities, 74% of the returned POWs expressed favorable views of American democracy. In fact, 61% supported the Marshall Plan and 55% advocated for a German-American alliance. This level of goodwill toward their former enemy was unheard of in history, yet it was the result of what the prisoners had experienced in America, an ideological shift that was as profound as any battlefield victory. By the 1950s, thousands of former POWs had legally immigrated to the United States, many of them choosing to settle permanently. Immigration records showed that around 5,000 former prisoners of war entered the U.S. during this time. These men, once sworn enemies of America, now sought to become part of the very society they had fought against. Their success stories are not just anecdotes, they are a testament to the power of American ideals to transform lives and to the enduring influence of the values they witnessed firsthand during their internment. Former prisoners of war went on to occupy important positions in both the United States and West Germany. Many worked in agricultural modernization, helping to rebuild the devastated German countryside. Others became educators, teaching the next generation about democracy and freedom. Some even found political success, with 48 former POWs serving as members of the German Bundestag and 312 serving as mayors or city councilors. These men played key roles in the democratic reconstruction of West Germany, applying the principles they had absorbed in America to help rebuild their own nation. One of the most poignant reflections came from Hans-Georg von Studnitz, a former POW who later became a prominent industrialist in Germany. In 1965, he shared with American historians, "We returned from America with more than memories. We brought knowledge of how democracy functions, how free markets operate, how diverse peoples cooperate. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked. These former POWs, who had once been the very embodiment of the Nazi war machine, had transformed into advocates for democracy and freedom. Their stories reflect the power of exposure to a different way of life, one that emphasized the importance of individual rights, political freedom, and the value of democracy. The experiences of these men and the impact that America had on them are proof that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won through force, but through the demonstration of ideals. The transformation of the German prisoners at Camp Herne didn't end with their release. In fact, it was only the beginning of a profound, long-lasting change in how they viewed the world, their enemies, and themselves. The re-education they had undergone in America had left an indelible mark on their lives, one that would echo through the years, both in the lives of the men who were directly impacted and in the broader history of post-war Europe. For many of the prisoners, the most remarkable aspect of their time in America was not just the material comforts they had been afforded or the kindness shown to them by civilians. It was the exposure to American democratic principles, to a society that, despite its flaws, stood as a beacon of freedom and opportunity in a world recovering from the ravages of war. The prison camps in the United States had served as a form of education that no battlefront could have provided. The American way of life, its values, its sense of individualism, its belief in democratic principles, had been shown not as propaganda or rhetoric, but as a lived reality. The prisoners saw that democracy wasn't just a political system, but a way of life. It was the freedom to speak openly, to disagree, and yet still work toward a common good. It was the willingness to offer second chances, even to one's enemies. This realization would stay with the prisoners long after they left the camps. For many, the shift in perspective was gradual but profound. The once ardent Nazis who had come to America full of hatred and prejudice now found themselves questioning their past beliefs. They had seen the flaws of Nazi ideology firsthand, not in some abstract political debate, but in the everyday realities of American society. The more they witnessed, the more they understood that the ideals they had fought for in Europe had been grounded in deception and tyranny, not strength and unity. For some of the prisoners, the realization came during moments of quiet reflection, during the long hours spent reading forbidden books in the camp's library, or listening to lectures about American history. For others, it came during their interactions with the American civilians who treated them with kindness, even when they were still viewed as enemies by the rest of the world. Butcher, for instance, would later describe his growing sense of disbelief as he watched American citizens, ordinary people, who had every reason to despise him and his comrades, go out of their way to treat them with dignity. He recalled how the kindness extended to them during Christmas, 1943, when the town of Herne raised funds for a holiday celebration for the prisoners, shattered any remaining illusions he had about the Americans being barbarians. The exposure to the racial dynamics in America also played a crucial role in reshaping the prisoners' worldview. In Nazi Germany, the idea of racial purity was not just an ideological concept, it was a foundational element of their society. The Nazis had built a system of hatred around the idea that racial differences were an inherent source of conflict, and that only through the dominance of the master race could the world be made right. But at Camp Herne, the German prisoners had witnessed a different reality. They had worked alongside black soldiers, who in the American military had equal authority over them. The racial dynamics in America, though flawed, were so different from anything the prisoners had known that it began to challenge everything they had been taught about racial superiority. Several of the prisoners, particularly those from high-ranking positions, had even requested transfers to other camps to avoid working under black soldiers. But they were told, in no uncertain terms, that such requests would not be entertained. It was an experience that defied their most deeply held beliefs. The prisoners were forced to confront the contradiction between their Nazi teachings and the reality of a world where racial differences didn't define a person's worth, and where those they had once considered inferior were now their equals. As the years went by, the lessons learned at Camp Hearn continued to shape the lives of the former prisoners. Many of them, like Gartner and Pell, chose to remain in America. They embraced their new lives, fully aware that their time in the U.S. had not only saved them from the despair of post-war Europe, but it also helped them rediscover their own humanity. In doing so, they became part of a larger process of reintegration and rebuilding, not just for themselves, but for their countries as well. Their stories were not unique. Thousands of German prisoners of war who had been detained in the United States returned home with a new understanding of the world. They had witnessed a society that operated not just on brute force, but on values that celebrated individual rights, democratic freedoms, and the ability of a diverse society to come together for the common good. These former POWs went on to play a significant role in the reconstruction of West Germany. Many became leaders in various fields, from agriculture to politics to education. The lessons they had learned in American camps, the values they had absorbed during their time in America, would guide them as they helped build a new democratic Germany in the post-war era. One of the most remarkable outcomes of the re-education process was the development of a shared understanding between former enemies. In 1984, for the 40th anniversary of D-Day, a group of former German prisoners of war returned to Texas for a reunion with the people they had once seen as their captors. The Hearn Democrat covered the event extensively, documenting the emotional exchanges between former prisoners and former guards. During the reunion, a former prisoner named Fritz Zimmermann said, "We came as enemies, believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength, that diversity creates rather than weakens unity." His words summed up the profound transformation that had taken place, not just in the lives of the individual prisoners, but in the very fabric of post-war Europe. The transformation of the German prisoners at Camp Hearn was a powerful demonstration of the potential for change, even in the most entrenched ideologies. It proved that the greatest victories in the struggle for democracy were not won on battlefields, but through the simple act of exposing the enemy to the ideals that made America great. And in the end, it was the humane treatment, the generosity, and the embrace of democratic values that would turn enemies into allies and contribute to the lasting peace that followed the war. The experience of the German prisoners of war in America during World War II left a lasting legacy that extended far beyond their individual transformations. The re-education they underwent, the exposure to American values and ideals, and the kindness extended to them by their captors reshaped not only their futures, but also the relationship between the United States and its former enemies. It was a transformation that was not only evident in the lives of the prisoners who chose to stay, but also in the broader geopolitical landscape that would follow. For the United States, the treatment of German prisoners of war represented a bold experiment in demonstrating the strength of democracy through its very practices. During the war, America had been fighting against the tyranny and brutality of Nazi Germany, yet it chose not to continue that fight through cruelty, but through compassion and understanding. The kindness shown to the POWs, the educational programs, the attention to their physical and emotional well-being, all underscored the fundamental difference between the United States and the totalitarian regimes they were combating. By providing these prisoners with an education that challenged their Nazi indoctrination, exposing them to American culture, and treating them with humanity, the United States demonstrated that its strength lay not just in military might, but in its unwavering commitment to the principles of freedom and democracy. The success of this re-education program became a model for post-war reconciliation and rebuilding, proving that true victory came not through defeating the enemy on the battlefield, but by demonstrating the ideals that made the victor's society stronger. For the prisoners themselves, the long-term effects of their time in American camps were profound. They returned home to Germany not as defeated soldiers, but as men who had been transformed by their experiences. Those who chose to stay in America, like Gartner, Pell, and many others, found success in a country they had once viewed as the enemy. Their decision to immigrate and integrate into American society was a testament to the power of that transformation. These men had witnessed firsthand the power of American democracy, and they were determined to carry those lessons with them as they rebuilt their own lives. The lessons of America's treatment of German POWs were also reflected in the new Germany that emerged in the post-war era. As former prisoners returned to a devastated country, they brought with them not just memories of their time in captivity, but also an understanding of the values that would help rebuild a democratic society. Many of them went on to become leaders in various fields, contributing to the reconstruction of West Germany and the formation of a new democratic state. Their contributions were not limited to the political or economic spheres, they also helped shape the cultural and educational systems that would become the foundation of modern Germany. This process of re-education and transformation had a profound impact on the way former enemies viewed each other. In the years after the war, Germany and the United States would become allies in the Cold War, united in their opposition to Soviet expansionism. The ideological shift that had taken place within the German prisoners was a key factor in this new relationship. The men who had once been the sworn enemies of the United States now saw in it a beacon of freedom, democracy, and opportunity, and this understanding laid the groundwork for the creation of a long-lasting partnership between the two nations. The reconciliation between former prisoners and their American captors would also have a lasting impact on both individuals and communities. In 1984, for example, the 40th anniversary of D-Day brought a group of former German POWs back to the United States for a reunion with the American families and soldiers who had once guarded them. The Herne Democrat, a local newspaper, documented the emotional exchanges during this event, capturing the profound transformation that had taken place over the years. These reunions were not just symbolic, they were a powerful reminder of how far both nations had come since the end of the war. As one former prisoner, Fritz Zimmermann, remarked during the reunion, "We came as enemies, believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength, that diversity creates rather than weakens unity." Zimmermann's words encapsulated the essence of the transformation that had taken place, not just in the lives of the individual prisoners, but in the relationship between the United States and Germany. The story of the German POWs who were held in American camps is not just a story of war, but a story of the power of values to shape history. The men who once saw America as the enemy came to understand its ideals, not through propaganda or political rhetoric, but through personal experience. Their transformation was a testament to the strength of American democracy and the power of exposure to new ideas. It proved that the most profound changes often occur not through force, but through the demonstration of ideals that can inspire even the most entrenched enemies. The legacy of America's treatment of German POWs is a powerful reminder that true victory lies not in the destruction of one's enemies, but in the ability to transform them into allies. Through the kindness, education, and compassion extended to these prisoners, the United States not only helped to rebuild Europe, but also helped to rebuild the hearts and minds of those who had once fought against it. This transformation didn't just shape the men who had been imprisoned, it shaped the future of nations, setting the stage for the Cold War alliances that would define the next several decades. In their quiet, often unnoticed way, the prisoners of war who came to America in the 1940s became symbols of the power of democracy to change even the most hardened minds and the most entrenched ideologies. The most lasting victory, it seemed, was not on the battlefield but in the hearts and minds of those who had once believed in something else.